Shaquille O'Neal, the basketball legend racially profiled in his own neighborhood, watch how he fights for change. Imagine cruising through your own neighborhood, the place you call home, where you've built your life, your career, your legacy. The air is cool, jazz hums through the speakers, and after a long, grueling day, you finally let yourself relax, until flashing red and blue lights snap you back to reality. Shaquille O'Neal, a man who had conquered the basketball world, faced challenges most couldn't even fathom. He fought his way up, defied every odd, proved that greatness knows no boundaries. Yet, on this quiet evening in Silver Lake, his success, his status, his name, none of it mattered. A routine drive turned into something far more unsettling. A police cruiser tailed him, lights piercing through the peaceful dusk. He hadn't been speeding. No traffic violations. No reason at all. But that familiar, sinking feeling crept into his chest. He had heard these stories before. He had seen them play out. But here, in his own community, pulled over without explanation, Shaq found himself face to face with Officer Drexler, a cold stare, a clipped command, license and registration. No greeting. No courtesy. Just suspicion. Even as he handed over his documents, it was clear they weren't just checking paperwork. They were checking him. Scrutinizing. Doubting. Then came the order. Step out of the vehicle. Confused, Shaquille did what anyone in his position would do. He questioned it. He stated the obvious. I live here. This is my car. I'm Shaquille O'Neal. But his name carried no weight in that moment. No recognition. No respect. Just a hand resting on a holstered gun and a voice that made it clear this wasn't a request. How does a man who has spent his life breaking barriers respond when the world still sees him as just another suspect? Watch as Shaquille O'Neal takes this moment of injustice and turns it into a fight for change. Like, comment, and subscribe, because this is bigger than one person. It's a movement. Shaquille O'Neal, a basketball icon targeted in his own neighborhood, the moment that changed everything. Shaquille O'Neal moved slowly as he pushed open the car door, every motion deliberate, controlled. He stepped out, standing tall beside his brand new Lexus, his heart pounding beneath his broad chest as Officer Drexler circled him like a predator sizing up its prey. The quiet, peaceful street now felt stifling, the air thick with an unspoken tension. We've had reports of stolen vehicles in the area, Drexler said, her eyes flicking between Shaquille and his car. This Lexus matches the description. Shaquille's jaw tightened. This is my car. I bought it just days ago. Run the plates. Everything checks out. But her expression didn't change. The doubt in her eyes, the way she scrutinized him, it was clear. She didn't see Shaquille O'Neal, the legend, the role model, the man who had earned his place in the world. She saw something else. Something that made her suspicious. Hands on the hood. Shaquille hesitated. Is this really necessary? His voice was measured, his disbelief barely contained. Hands on the hood. Her tone sharpened. Clipped. Absolute. A flicker of movement caught his eye. Behind the curtains, neighbors watched. Some in shock, others in quiet judgment. The humiliation stung, sharper than the cold metal beneath his palms as he complied. Officer Drexler's hands moved over him, a rough, indifferent pat down. She didn't care about his words. Didn't care about his innocence. To her, he was just another suspect. Another black man in a nice car. This vehicle matches the description of one stolen last week, she muttered. Shaquille inhaled sharply. I told you. This car is mine. His voice, tight with restrained anger, carried through the empty street. But she wasn't listening. She never had been. Then, her hand moved toward her cuffs. Shaquille felt it, the moment where everything could spiral. His pulse thundered, but his mind was clear. He had fought battles before. But this wasn't about strength. This was about standing his ground without giving them a reason. Before she could make a decision she'd regret, his voice cut through the tension. Steady. Unshaken. Before you do something you can't take back, call your superior. Drexler froze. For the first time, hesitation flickered across her face. Shaquille didn't break eye contact. Run my plates. Call your captain. The moment stretched long, heavy. The air between them crackled. And then, with a muttered curse, Drexler reached for her radio. Justice had started to turn in his favor, but the damage was already done. As he stood there, hands still resting on the hood of his own car, Shaquille felt the weight of injustice settle deep into his chest. The serene night had shifted, charged now with an energy that pulsed through the neighborhood. He could feel the eyes on him. Neighbors. Strangers. Watching. Judging. This wasn't just a routine stop, it was a spectacle. And he was the unwilling star. Drexler's demeanor wavered as she listened to the voice on the radio. Shaquille saw something flicker in her eyes, uncertainty. Maybe even fear. Not fear of him. Fear of what would come next. And in that moment, Shaquille thought of his family. His wife, Maya. His kids, Michael and Olivia. He thought of the conversations he had with his son. How to navigate situations like this. How to stay calm. How to de-escalate. Michael had once asked him, "Dad, does it ever get better? Do people ever stop seeing us like this?" Shaquille had wanted to tell him yes. But the truth sat too heavy on his tongue. Instead, he had told his son to stay strong. To stay dignified. To never let anyone strip him of his worth. And yet, here he stood. His dignity, his humanity, placed under scrutiny by someone who saw only his skin, not the man behind it. This wasn't just a traffic stop. This was a reminder that no matter how high you rise, no matter how much you achieve, the world will always find a way to remind you where it thinks you belong. But Shaquille O'Neal? He wasn't the kind of man to let the world decide that for him. This moment would not define him. It would ignite him. Watch how Shaquille O'Neal takes this injustice and turns it into a movement. Because this isn't just about one man. It's about all of us. Shaquille O'Neal, a basketball legend racially profiled, the moment that changed everything. The seconds dragged on, each one heavier than the last. The radio crackled again, and Officer Drexler visibly tensed. Shaquille couldn't make out the words, but he didn't need to. Her face said it all. She had made a mistake, a colossal one. And now, she had to face the reality of what she had done. Slowly, Shaquille lowered his hands from the hood of his car, turning to face her. His eyes locked onto hers, steady and unshaken. "Well?" His voice was low, firm. Measured. "What now, officer?" For a moment, she said nothing. She just stood there, her expression a mix of embarrassment and stubborn defiance. The confidence she had moments ago, the authority she had wielded so carelessly, was slipping away. Her hand, which had hovered over her radio, dropped to her side. She exhaled sharply, as if trying to collect herself, but it was clear. She was shaken. She started, fumbling for words. There seems to have been a misunderstanding. Shaquille raised an eyebrow, the anger he had been holding back bubbling just beneath the surface. A misunderstanding? His voice cut through the air like a blade. "That's what we're calling it now?" Drexler shifted uncomfortably. I thought. Shaquille didn't let her finish. "You thought what?" His tone sharpened, his control unwavering. "That I stole this car? That I'm just another criminal driving through this neighborhood because I don't belong here?" He took a step closer, his towering frame casting a long shadow over her. His movements were slow, deliberate. Not threatening. Just undeniable. "Tell me, officer," he said, his voice even but cutting. "What exactly went through your mind when you pulled me over?" Because I'd really love to understand how a man who has given so much to this city, made people proud, represented something more, is still seen as nothing but a suspect in his own neighborhood. Her face flushed a deep red. But she didn't answer. She couldn't. Because there was no answer that could justify what she had done. The silence stretched between them, thick and suffocating. Then, the low rumble of another engine broke through the tension. A second police cruiser pulled up. Shaquille immediately recognized the man who stepped out. Captain Rivera. A veteran officer, his dark hair streaked with gray, his face carrying the weight of years spent navigating the delicate politics of law enforcement. He moved with purpose, his expression unreadable as he approached. Shaquille, Rivera called out, his voice steady but urgent. I am so sorry about this. He shot a sharp look at Drexler, then back at Shaquille. We got the call, and, well, it looks like there's been a terrible mistake. Shaquille folded his arms across his chest, his jaw clenched tight. Mistake, he repeated, his voice filled with quiet bitterness. That's the word we're using tonight, huh? Rivera exhaled heavily. He glanced at Drexler, who stood stiffly, her face burning with shame. Then he turned back to Shaquille. I can't tell you how sorry I am for this, the captain said, his voice laced with regret. This is unacceptable. Shaquille's anger simmered beneath the surface, but he kept his voice level. Controlled. Sorry won't undo what's already been done, Captain. I was humiliated in front of my own neighbors. My character, my integrity, who I am, was reduced to nothing in a matter of minutes. He stepped forward, his gaze unflinching. What happens next? What do you do about this? Rivera ran a hand through his hair, clearly uncomfortable. We'll handle this internally, he said. I'll make sure Officer Drexler faces consequences. This isn't something we take lightly. Shaquille studied him, his sharp eyes searching for any sign of sincerity. He had seen this before, too many times. Officers reprimanded behind closed doors, a slap on the wrist, a weak apology. But the system? The system that allowed racial profiling to thrive? That remained untouched. He wasn't interested in empty gestures. I want more than just an internal review, Captain. His voice hardened. I want this to be public. I want this to be addressed in front of the community. I want people to see that there are real consequences for racial profiling. I want transparency. And I want action. Rivera hesitated. His gaze flicked to Drexler, whose face had gone pale. Shaquille, I understand your frustration. No, Captain, Shaquille interrupted. You don't understand. Not really. You've never had to live with this. But I do. And so does every other black man and woman who's ever been in my position. He exhaled, shaking his head. If we don't make this right, if we don't hold people accountable, it's just going to keep happening. The captain swallowed hard. Then, slowly, he nodded. You're right, he admitted, his voice quieter now. You're absolutely right. Shaquille took a deep breath. This moment was bigger than him. It was bigger than a single officer's mistake. This was about change. And he wasn't walking away without it. Shaquille O'Neal, a basketball icon's fight against racial injustice, the moment that changed everything. The tension in Shaquille's chest loosened, just a fraction. Then do something about it, he said simply, his voice steady but firm. Captain Rivera looked at Officer Drexler once more, then turned back to Shaquille. I will, Shaquille. I promise you, I will. But Shaquille had heard promises like this before. Too many times. And as he stood there, watching the captain try to salvage the situation, he knew this was only the beginning. This wasn't just about his own dignity. This was about something bigger. A fight for everyone who had ever been wrongly judged, not by their actions, but by the color of their skin. As the night deepened, Shaquille turned toward his car. His mind was already racing. This fight wasn't over. Not by a long shot. He drove home in silence. The once soothing jazz had faded, replaced by the low hum of his Lexus, the only sound accompanying him. The streets, usually familiar and comforting, now felt different. Foreign. The weight of the evening's events sat heavy in the air. It wasn't the first time he had faced discrimination. But something about this encounter cut deeper. Maybe it was the setting, his own neighborhood, where he was supposed to feel safe, respected. Or maybe it was the stark reminder that no matter how much he had achieved, there would always be those who saw him as less. His hands gripped the steering wheel tighter as he pulled into the driveway, the shadows of the large oak tree stretching across the front yard. He could see the porch light flicker on. Through the window, he spotted Maya moving through the house, likely setting the table for dinner, completely unaware of what had just happened. Maya had always been his rock. Steady. Strong. Understanding. But even with her support, there were things Shaquille had never fully shared with her. How could he explain the feeling of always being on edge? Of knowing that, at any moment, his very existence could invite suspicion, hostility, or worse. Finally, he exhaled, pushed open the car door, and stepped out. The cool evening air brushed against his skin, but it did nothing to calm the fire simmering inside him. He paused for a moment, staring at his house, a beautiful two-story home, the kind he had only dreamed of growing up in a cramped apartment in the city. But tonight, it felt like a facade. A reminder that even the most successful among them could never fully escape the burden of racial profiling. Each step toward the front door felt heavier than the last. Before he could reach for the doorknob, it swung open. Maya stood there, her face lighting up the way it always did when she saw him. "Hey, love," she said warmly. "Dinner's almost ready. How was your day?" Shaquille hesitated for a split second. Then, forcing a small smile, he stepped inside. It was long. The familiar scent of Maya's cooking filled the air, usually comforting, but tonight, it barely registered. "I'll be right in," he added. "Just need a minute." Maya steadied him, her sharp eyes scanning his face. She knew him too well. "Shaquille," she said softly. "What happened?" He sighed, running a hand over his head. "I got pulled over." Her expression shifted, her brows knitting together. "Pulled over? For what?" His jaw tightened. "Racial profiling." The words left a bitter taste in his mouth. "I was driving home. An officer assumed I stole my own car." Maya's confusion turned to anger in an instant. "Are you serious? In this neighborhood? Who was it? What did they say?" "Officer Drexler," he muttered, heading toward the kitchen. "She didn't say much, just treated me like I was a criminal. Until her captain showed up and realized who I was." Maya followed, her eyes blazing. "This is unacceptable. You're one of the most respected athletes in this city. How dare they?" Shaquille exhaled sharply. "It doesn't matter." His voice was low but firm. "None of that matters when they see my skin first." Maya fell silent. Because she knew he was right. Their lives were comfortable. Their success, hard-earned. But no amount of money, fame, or status could erase the reality of being black in America. She had faced it herself. In her career. In spaces where her intelligence was questioned, her professionalism dismissed, where she had to prove her worth in ways others didn't. She inhaled deeply, grounding herself. Then, her voice softened, but her resolve remained. "What are you going to do about it?" Shaquille leaned against the kitchen counter, his hands gripping the edge as he stared at the floor. "I don't know yet," he admitted. "Captain Rivera said they'd handle it internally." He scoffed. "But that's not enough. It's never enough." He lifted his gaze, the fire in his eyes burning hotter. "I need to do something more. This can't keep happening. Not to me. Not to anyone." Maya stepped closer, placing a firm hand on his arm. "You're right," she said. "It can't. Then, softer, more certain. "But whatever you decide, you know I'm with you." Shaquille nodded, grateful for her unwavering support. But the weight of what came next, that was his to carry. Shaquille O'Neal, more than a basketball legend, taking a stand against injustice. The decision pressed heavily on him. Shaquille had always been a man of action, a man who believed in using his platform for change. But tonight had shaken something deep within him. He had dedicated his life not just to winning games, but to ensuring fairness off the court. And yet, he had been subjected to the very injustice he had fought against. Later that evening, after dinner, after the kids were tucked into bed, Shaquille found himself in his study. The soft glow of the desk lamp illuminated the room, casting long shadows over his trophies, his awards, his framed certificates, a lifetime of achievement. But tonight, they felt hollow. He opened his laptop, his fingers moving quickly over the keys as he drafted an official complaint against Officer Drexler. But as he typed, a nagging thought took hold. Was this enough? Would filing a complaint really change anything? Or would it be just another case lost in the bureaucratic shuffle, another injustice buried beneath red tape and hollow apologies? His hands hovered over the keyboard. The rage he had been suppressing all evening surged to the surface. This wasn't just about him. This was about every black man and woman who had ever been treated as less, as suspicious, as dangerous, simply because of the color of their skin. Shaquille clenched his jaw. He couldn't let this go. He had to do more. With renewed determination, he opened a new document. This time, he wasn't writing a complaint. He was writing a statement. A letter to the local news outlets. A detailed account of what had happened. A call to action. A demand for a public conversation on racial profiling in his community. He was done fighting quiet battles behind closed doors. If the system wouldn't change from within, then he would force it to change by making sure the whole community knew what had transpired. He clicked save. Then, he leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly. It wasn't enough to protect himself. He had a responsibility, a platform, a voice, and he was going to use it. The silence of the house wrapped around him, but inside, he felt the weight of something much larger. The night had been heavy, but now it was balanced by purpose. This fight wasn't over. It was just beginning. Shaquille stood at the window, looking out at the quiet street beyond. The neighbors who had watched from behind their curtains, who had witnessed his humiliation, would soon know the full story. And once they did, he would make sure they couldn't look away. As he finally headed to bed, the anger still simmered beneath the surface. But now, it was focused. Directed. Tomorrow, he would take action. Not just for himself, but for everyone who had ever been wronged by a system that saw them as guilty before innocent. And this time, the community would have no choice but to listen. Shaquille woke early the next morning, his mind already buzzing with the weight of the day ahead. Sunlight filtered through the curtains, sharp and bright, illuminating not just his surroundings, but his intentions. Last night had been for thinking, for planning. Today was for action. Downstairs, Maya was already up, her light footsteps moving through the kitchen. The smell of fresh coffee filled the house, warm and familiar. But Shaquille wasn't hungry. Something deeper gnawed at him. Because this wasn't just about clearing his name. It wasn't about revenge. It was about exposing the truth. A truth that too many in his community had been forced to live with for too long. As he buttoned his crisp white shirt and pulled on dark slacks, he caught his reflection in the mirror. The man staring back at him? He wasn't just an athlete today. Today, he was an advocate. A voice for the voiceless. He had spent years playing by the rules, working within the system. But it was clear now. The system was broken. And today, he was confronting it head-on. Downstairs, Maya was pouring coffee when she heard him coming down the stairs. She turned, her eyes immediately locking onto his face. She knew that look. "You're leaving early," she said gently, watching him closely. Shaquille nodded, grabbing his briefcase from the hallway. "There's something I need to take care of." Maya set the coffee pot down, stepping toward him. "You're going through with it, aren't you?" she asked, her voice steady. "The press? The public statement?" He met her gaze, unwavering. "I have to, Maya. This isn't just about me anymore. It's about all of us." He exhaled. "If I don't speak up, then who will?" She sighed, her fingers resting lightly on his arm. "I know," she said softly. "Just be careful. You know how these things can escalate." Shaquille placed his hand over hers, giving it a reassuring squeeze. "I will," he promised. Then, with quiet conviction, "But we can't stay silent. Shaquille O'Neal, fight bigger than himself." Maya nodded, concern still etched on her face. "Just don't carry this alone," she said softly. Shaquille kissed her forehead and stepped out, his mind racing. The morning air was crisp, but it only sharpened his focus. First, the community center. He needed evidence, Drexler's file, anything that solidified his case. Then, a meeting with Captain Rivera, this time with a clear demand for accountability. As he drove, his thoughts drifted. How many others had been in this position? Wrongfully accused, humiliated, without a voice to fight back. His fame gave him protection, but that only deepened his responsibility. He had to act, not just for himself, but for all of them. At the community center, his plan was set. He reached out to journalists who had covered social justice before. They were eager to expose the truth. Then, he made the call. "Captain, it's Shaquille. We need to talk about last night." Rivera sighed. "I figured you'd call. We're conducting an internal review." "That's not enough," Shaquille interrupted. "This needs to be public. The community deserves transparency." Rivera hesitated. "Going public will stir a media storm. Is that what you want?" Shaquille's grip on the phone tightened. "I want the truth out there. If that creates a storm, so be it." A long pause. Then, "All right. I'll set up a press conference. But you'd better be ready for the fallout." Shaquille exhaled, his resolve unshaken. "I've been ready my whole life." That afternoon, he met with reporters, stepping into unfamiliar territory. This was bigger than basketball. Bigger than him. "I was racially profiled in my own neighborhood," he stated, his voice unwavering. "Despite everything I've accomplished, I was still seen as a suspect because of the color of my skin." He laid out the events of the night, the humiliation, the injustice. "I'm not here for sympathy," he continued. "This is not an isolated incident. This is a systemic issue, and it needs to stop." He called for a full investigation, for real change in police training. By the time he finished, the reporters were locked in, their pens flying. This story would make waves. And that was exactly the point. The aftermath was immediate. Silver Lake, once quiet, became the center of a national conversation. Social media exploded. News stations debated the incident. Some stood with Shaquille. Others accused him of stirring unnecessary tension. The pushback was fierce. He received messages of support, but also hostility. Anonymous threats. Accusations of playing the race card. The backlash was expected, but the weight of it was still heavy. At dinner, the tension in his home was palpable. His son, Michael, barely touched his food. "What's wrong?" Shaquille asked gently. Michael hesitated. "Some kids at school, they said you're making everything about race. That you just want attention." Shaquille's chest tightened. "Michael, what happened to me wasn't fair," he said carefully. "And when you stand up for what's right, some people won't like it. But that doesn't mean you stop fighting." Michael nodded, but the uncertainty in his eyes lingered. Maya placed a hand on their son's shoulder. "Your dad is standing up for something important," she reassured him. "And sometimes, doing the right thing makes people uncomfortable." Shaquille swallowed the frustration burning in his chest. This wasn't just his fight anymore. It was affecting his family. And that only fueled him further. At the community center the next day, the shift was evident. People avoided his gaze. Conversations hushed as he walked past. Then came the meeting with Mr. Carson, a community leader hesitant to stir the waters. "I get what you're doing," Carson said cautiously. "But going public like this? It's making things difficult." Shaquille's jaw tightened. "So I should stay silent? Let them sweep it under the rug?" Carson sighed. "I just don't want you to throw away everything you've built over one incident." "One incident?" Shaquille repeated, disbelief in his voice. "This is bigger than me. If we don't stand up, nothing changes." Carson hesitated, then gave a slow nod. "Just be careful." Shaquille left, frustration simmering beneath his skin. He had expected this pushback, but it didn't make it sting any less. The press conference was set. Cameras flashed. Reporters crowded the room. Captain Rivera spoke first, acknowledging the incident and promising reforms. Officer Drexler stood beside him, pale, her expression unreadable. Then, Shaquille stepped up to the podium. "This isn't about one officer," he said. "It's about a system that profiles based on race. That assumes guilt without cause." He let the words settle. "I was treated like a criminal in my own neighborhood because of my skin color. And that is unacceptable." His voice strengthened. "I'm here today for every person who's been harassed, pulled over, or worse, without cause. This must stop. And it stops here." The room erupted in questions, but Shaquille was ready. He answered with the same precision he had on the court, direct, firm, unshaken. The conversation was shifting. Change was in motion. In the following weeks, Shaquille remained a visible advocate. He spoke at town halls, in schools, and community forums. He helped form a task force for better police-community relations. Even Officer Drexler, under scrutiny, took it upon herself to undergo additional training and engage in community outreach. Change wasn't instant, but it had started. At a packed town hall meeting, a young woman stood up, her voice trembling. "Mr. O'Neill, because of you, I feel like I can speak up too. My brother was profiled last month. I didn't know what to do. Now I see there's a way to fight back." Shaquille nodded. "That's why I'm here," he said simply. "This isn't just my fight. It's ours." Months later, Silver Lake had transformed. The task force pushed for policy changes. Conversations that once seemed impossible were happening in schools, churches, and homes. But change wasn't easy. There were still incidents. Still reminders of the long road ahead. One evening, a group of young black men was stopped by police under suspicious circumstances. The community, now empowered, rallied fast. The officers were placed on administrative leave pending investigation. At an emergency town hall, Captain Rivera admitted, "We've made progress. But we're not there yet." Shaquille, standing beside him, added, "This isn't about pointing fingers. It's about fixing the system. Every incident is a reminder, we have to keep pushing." The resistance was still there. But so was the will to change. As the year came to a close, the community held a festival celebrating unity. Shaquille stood under the lights, his family beside him, as he addressed the crowd. "We've come a long way," he said. "But this isn't the end. Each one of us here has a role to play. We keep pushing. We keep fighting for what's right." As the night filled with music, laughter, and hope, Shaquille watched from the sidelines, his heart full. The fight for justice was far from over. But they were moving forward. Step by step. Together.